Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story: The Cursed Shrine, a tale of dark magic and vengeful spirits. The mountains of Vietnam stretched before them like an endless sea of mist and darkened trees. Thick clouds clung to the jagged peaks, casting an ominous shadow over the forest below. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something ancient, as though the land itself had been soaked in forgotten blood and sorrow. Dr. Ling Vu, the lead archaeologist, wiped a layer of sweat from his brow, even though the temperature had dropped uncomfortably low. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the map that had led them here, deep into the jungle, to a place that should have been left untouched, the shrine of Bai Liu. "There's no turning back now," he muttered to himself, glancing at the rest of his team. 4 others stood behind him, their faces set with determination and the quiet excitement of discovery. The locals had warned them, of course. They always did. "The spirits are angry," they had said. "This land is cursed." But they were archaeologists, not superstitious villagers. Curiosity had driven them, a thirst for knowledge that could not be quenched by mere folklore. They trudged through the thick underbrush, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. As they neared the shrine, the trees began to thin, revealing a structure that looked like it had risen out of the mountain itself. The stones were dark with age, and the air around it was so still, as if time had frozen in place. Ling felt a shiver crawl up his spine. It was a sensation he couldn't shake off, a feeling that something was wrong. "Let's set up camp here," he said, his voice tight with apprehension. They were just moments from entering the shrine, and yet, for the first time, he hesitated. As night fell, the group gathered around their fire, the warmth of the flames a stark contrast to the cold, damp atmosphere that seemed to cling to everything. The forest was alive with the sounds of distant creatures, but as the wind howled through the trees, Ling couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet it was near the shrine. Suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence. A faint scraping, like nails dragging across stone. Ling's head snapped up, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if the others had heard it, but the sound was undeniable. "Did you hear that?" one of the team members whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Ling nodded, but he said nothing. He was not about to admit to the others what he was already beginning to suspect. The shrine was not just a relic of the past. It was alive with something dark, something vengeful. Hours passed, and the team finally settled down for sleep. But sleep did not come easily. Strange noises echoed in the darkness, whispers that seemed to move through the walls of the shrine, faint footsteps that could have been human but were too soft to be real. And then As Lin drifted into an uneasy slumber, a chilling wail pierced the night air, a sound so mournful, so filled with despair, that it made his blood run cold. The next morning, things began to unravel. The camp was in disarray, tents torn, equipment scattered as though a storm had passed through. But there was no sign of any storm. No wind, no rain, just an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Where is everyone?" Lin demanded, his voice trembling with growing panic. The team had vanished without a trace. Only the cryptic, jagged marks carved into the stone near the shrine remained. Symbols that didn't belong to any known language. No answers, only questions. As the days dragged on, one by one, the team members disappeared. Mai first, then Dewey, then even Bao, who had been the most skeptical of them all. Each time, there were whispers, scratches, and cryptic messages left in the wake of their absence. Lin was the last to remain. His breath came in short gasps as he stood at the foot of the shrine, staring at the strange markings that now seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He had seen enough. The curse was real. The spirits were awake. But it wasn't until the final night, when Lin stood before the altar, that he understood the true nature of the curse. The whispers, the scratches, the cries, it was all part of a ritual, a trap set by the sorcerer who had been bound to the shrine centuries ago. His soul had never left, and now Lin was the final offering. The spirits had not been seeking vengeance. They had been guiding him, warning him that the true horror was not in the curse itself, but in the revelation that the sorcerer's soul had been imprisoned within the shrine for eternity, trapped by his own dark magic. Lin could feel the sorcerer's presence now, cold, suffocating, pulling him into the stone. But it wasn't too late. Lin's mind raced, and as the sorcerer's shadow loomed larger, he remembered the one thing the villagers had said: "Only when the last soul is consumed will the curse be lifted." With a final cry, Lin turned and fled into the night. He didn't know if the curse had truly ended, but one thing was clear: he was the last one alive. And as he ran, he heard the whispers again. This time, not from the shrine, but from deep within his own mind. The curse had not been lifted. It had merely passed on.
The title of the story:
The Village of Eternal Darkness, bound by a forbidden spell. Lucas had always been drawn to the unknown, to places untouched by time or the outside world. So when he heard whispers of a forgotten village hidden in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, he couldn't resist. The locals in nearby towns spoke in hushed tones about the village, known only as Lang Le, where no one ever left. But that's all they ever said. No one ever spoke of why. On a humid afternoon, Lucas arrived, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, dark earth beneath the dense canopy of trees. The village, once vibrant, now looked as though it had been abandoned by time itself. Wooden huts, worn by centuries of neglect, lined the dirt paths. The air was thick, the trees towering like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for the sky. Everything seemed still. Despite the eerie silence, Lucas pressed on. He wasn't here to be afraid. The village was full of rumors, tales of strange rituals, old superstitions, and mysterious disappearances. Lucas, an explorer by nature, had always sought out the peculiar. He wasn't concerned with the local legends, but as he made his way toward the heart of the village, a strange sensation crept up his spine, a feeling that he was being watched, not by eyes, but by something far more ancient. The villagers were kind, though distant. They spoke little of the past, and their eyes always darted nervously toward the old stone well at the center of the village. At night, the village grew unnaturally quiet, with no sounds of wildlife to break the oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. It was on the 4th day of his stay that Lucas stumbled upon the abandoned house. It sat on the outskirts, its door slightly ajar as though waiting for someone to find it. Curiosity overtook him. He pushed the door open, the creaking sound slicing through the still air, sending a shiver down his spine. Inside, the house was suffocatingly dark. Dust swirled in the air, catching the slivers of moonlight that filtered through the cracked windows. The scent of age and mildew hung thickly in the air. As Lucas explored the rooms, he noticed something strange. The walls were covered in strange symbols, faint but clearly etched into the wood. Intrigued, he carefully opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. The text was written in an archaic script he didn't recognize, but the symbols were hauntingly familiar. The language was foreign, yet the incantation was unmistakable. The spell was clear: to bind a soul, to trap it for eternity, to protect oneself from the vengeance of spirits wronged. The realization hit him like a blow. The villagers, this family of sorcerers, had trapped the spirits of their enemies, sealing them into the very land beneath the village. The manuscript spoke of endless torment, of souls forced to remain within the confines of the village, never to escape. It was a powerful and forbidden spell, one that came at a terrible price, and the villagers had been keeping it a secret for generations. That night, something changed. The air in the village grew heavy, pressing down on Lucas as though something was watching him. He could hear whispers, low and incomprehensible, fluting in the air around him. He looked up, his breath quickening. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and the air grew colder.
His room felt suffocating, the walls closing in. The floorboards creaked as though someone or something was moving just beyond his sight. The whispers grew louder, closer, until Lucas couldn't ignore them any longer. "Get out," the voices hissed. His heart raced. He stumbled to his feet, his mind reeling from the discovery. It was impossible to ignore the rising sense of dread that settled over him. He had awoken something, disturbed the balance that had kept the spirits bound, and they were angry. They were coming for him. The door to his room slammed shut, trapping him inside. The whispering intensified.
Now a chorus of frantic, tormented voices. They called to him, their words garbled and pleading. He could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, creaking on the wooden floor outside his door. Terrified, Lucas grabbed the manuscript and ran to the village center, desperate to find someone who could help. But the village was empty. No one was in sight. The wind howled, rattling the leaves of the trees. The air grew thicker, heavier with each passing second. In the distance, he saw the stone well, the source of the curse. It was there, beneath the earth, where the souls were trapped. The only way to break the spell was to release them, but doing so would mean confronting the family who had cast the curse in the first place. A shadow passed over him, and Lucas turned to find himself face to face with an older man, a villager, but one who seemed to blend with the darkness itself. His eyes were hollow, devoid of emotion. The man spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "You should not have come here." Lucas stood frozen, the weight of his discovery crashing down on him. The family's secret had been buried for a reason, and now the curse had been unleashed. As the man approached, the air seemed to ripple with dark energy. The spirits, now fully manifest, emerged from the shadows. They circled around him, their pale, tortured faces staring with an unspoken hunger. The whispers became deafening. But then, as if by some twist of fate, the spirits halted. They turned away, their attention shifting to something or someone else. The old man smiled, a sinister grin creeping across his face. He stepped into the shadows, vanishing from his sight. Lucas felt the cold touch of realization. The spirits weren't after him. They were after the man. They were seeking revenge on the very family who had cursed them to eternal torment. In the end, Lucas was not the one who had to face the curse. He was merely a witness to the long overdue reckoning. As the spirits closed in on the man, his screams echoed through the village, swallowed by the darkness. The curse was broken. But at what cost? And as Lucas left the village, the air still thick with magic, he could hear the faintest whispers behind him, reminding him that some curses, no matter how broken, never truly end.
The title of the story: The Haunted Ritual, a dark binding that should never have been broken. The air grew thick with a damp, musty scent as the group of adventurers made their way deeper into the dense forest, their boots crunching on the carpet of decaying leaves beneath them. They had heard the stories. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the ancient temple that stood hidden among the trees, its history steeped in darkness and forgotten by time. The temple, lost to the world for centuries, was the subject of whispered superstitions, stories about an occult ritual, said to bind the spirits of vengeful demons, trapping them in the sacred grounds. The locals, with their nervous glances and quick steps, avoided the place. They claimed it was cursed, that disturbing the temple's relics would break the seal and release horrors long since bound. But for Alex, Sarah, Ethan, and Riley, those warnings were nothing but superstitions.
They were thrill-seekers, drawn by the allure of the unknown, eager to prove that the old tales were nothing more than fiction. They had been traveling for hours through the tangled forest, the sun long set behind a thick canopy of trees, when they finally arrived. The temple loomed ahead, partially hidden by the encroaching foliage. Its stone walls were weathered and cracked, draped in moss that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air was heavy, a stillness hanging in the space around them as though the forest itself held its breath. "This is it," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. The others stood in awe, their eyes wide with a mix of excitement and unease. Riley fumbled with his camera, eager to capture the moment. "Let's do this," he said, though his words sounded more like a plea than a command. Despite the creeping dread crawling up their spines, they pushed forward, ignoring the gut feeling that told them to turn back. The iron doors of the temple creaked as they pushed them open, the sound echoing through the hollow space within. A strange chill seeped into their bones as they stepped inside, the stone floor cold beneath their feet. Dust particles danced in the dim light that filtered through cracked windows, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Strange symbols, etched into the stone and faded with age, adorned the surfaces. The air was thick with the scent of old incense, and the faintest sound of whisperings seemed to flutter just beyond their hearing. "This place is ancient," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a breath. "It feels wrong." Ethan, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "It's just a ruin. You're letting the stories get to you." But even as he spoke, a sense of dread began to settle over them. The further they ventured into the temple, the more the oppressive atmosphere weighed on their minds. It was as though the very stones of the building were watching them, judging them for trespassing where they didn't belong. They entered the inner chamber, a vast space dominated by an altar of dark stone. At the center stood an intricately carved pedestal, adorned with relics, ancient statues, chalices, and ritualistic objects. It was a disturbing sight, but there was something about the objects that called to them. Without thinking, they began to inspect the relics, running their fingers over the carvings and tracing the worn edges. "That looks out of place," Riley muttered, pointing at a small stone tablet that rested on the altar. It was etched with strange runes, unlike anything they had seen before. Alex approached it, his curiosity getting the better of him. He reached out to touch the tablet, and as his fingers made contact with the cool stone, the air seemed to shift. A low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the walls, and the whispers, now louder, seemed to grow from the very stone itself. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice trembled as she stepped back, her face pale. But it was too late. The seal had been broken. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the temple seemed to come alive, its walls groaning as though they were waking from a long slumber. Shadows flitted across the room, moving with a speed and grace that seemed unnatural. And then the voices, the whispers, became clearer, like distant chants growing louder with each second. Ethan staggered back, his eyes wide with panic. "What did you do?" he yelled at Alex, but his words were drowned out by the rising crescendo of the voices.
The temperature dropped drastically, and Alex could see his breath misting in front of him. The once still air now buzzed with an oppressive energy, as if something was pushing against them. A horrible sound, like the scraping of bones, echoed from the shadows, and a low growl filled the chamber. From the corner of his eye, Alex saw figures moving in the dark, but when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. A gust of wind stirred the dust on the floor, and for a brief moment, he saw a shadowy figure standing before him, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. "Run!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. The group scrambled toward the entrance, but the door had changed. The once wide and welcoming was now a twisted mass of splintered wood. It groaned as if something was trying to push its way through from the other side. Their efforts to pry it open were futile. The door refused to budge. A sudden piercing scream echoed from deep within the temple. Riley. They turned just in time to see him vanish into the darkness, his body jerking as if pulled by unseen hands. "No!" Alex shouted, but it was too late. Riley was gone. Panic set in, and the group split up, desperate to escape. But everywhere they turned, the shadows grew more intense, more oppressive. The whispers followed them, close, too close. The walls seemed to close in, and with each passing second, the air became more suffocating. Ethan, once bold, now trembled in fear. He was the next to fall. He stumbled, his eyes wide in terror as his body jerked violently. His scream was cut off abruptly, swallowed by the darkness. Now it was just Sarah and Alex, the last two. "We need to get out of here," Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. We can't stay." They raced through the temple, but it seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls shifting and twisting, leading them in circles. The whispers grew louder, their meaning becoming clearer. "You disturbed the seal. Now you must pay." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Alex and Sarah found themselves standing in the heart of the temple, facing the altar once more. The room was eerily quiet. The shadows had receded, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. What happened?" Alex breathed, his mind reeling from the surreal experience. But as he glanced down, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A thin, jagged line of blood running from the stone tablet to the altar. He followed the blood trail with his eyes, and when he looked up, he realized with growing horror that Sarah was no longer standing beside him. Instead, she was kneeling at the altar, her body contorted unnaturally. Her face was pale, and her eyes wide and glassy, stared straight at him, empty and devoid of recognition. Before he could react, the whispers returned, louder now, as if they were laughing at his fate. "Too late," they hissed. In a blink of an eye, Alex was alone. The temple was silent again, but the horror would never leave him. The curse was now complete. The villagers would speak of the adventurous for years to come, but no one would ever venture near the temple again. For in the heart of the forest, the spirits of the demons were free.
waiting for the next fools to break the seal that should never have been touched.